Mark Rivers, a cool and self-assured billionaire, always had an air of superiority as he stood on the balcony at a swanky party. Nothing ever seemed to ruffle him, until his old buddy Tony Malone strolled up with a glass of wine and a cheeky grin. "Mark, aren't you the one who says money can buy anything?" Tony teased, breaking the quiet. Mark took a sip of his champagne, his face remaining as unmoved as ever. "It sure can," he replied. Tony leaned casually on the railing and pointed to a young woman sitting on the sidewalk below. She was barefoot, dressed in tattered clothes, and had an exhausted look in her eyes. "Check her out," Tony said with a challenging tone. "Your next challenge. I bet $2 million you can't transform her into a high-society lady and keep her as your wife for 3 months." Mark narrowed his eyes as he stared at her. To him, she wasn't a person, just another piece on his chessboard. Confident he could win the bet, he smirked. "You're clearly underestimating me, Tony." Tony raised his glass in a toast, his expression daring, while Mark silently observed the scene below. The young woman seemed completely unaware of her surroundings, a small plastic cup at her side, clinking with a few coins. "Looks like tonight's show is about to start," Mark murmured before heading back inside. Soon, Mark found himself stepping onto the sidewalk right in front of the young woman. Under the dim glow of a streetlight, her haggard figure became clearer, her messy hair framing a face marked by fatigue, yet showing a quiet inner strength that caught his attention. She clutched a piece of cardboard with uneven handwriting that read, "Anything helps." "Excuse me," Mark said, his tone more commanding than polite. Startled, the woman looked up. Her tired blue eyes revealed a hidden resolve that Mark hadn't expected. "What do you want?" she asked in a weary voice, shrinking back slightly. Mark offered a smile that mixed a bit of condescension with curiosity. "I've got a proposal for you, a chance to change your life." She frowned, clearly suspicious, but stayed silent. "I'm serious," he said, crouching down to meet her eyes. "My name is Rivers. I have a lot of money, and I need someone just like you for a personal project." "Project?" she replied bitterly with a soft laugh, showing her worn teeth. "I'm not your lab rat, mister." Mark brushed aside her tone. "I'm willing to pay well. You'll get food, clothes, and a place to stay. All I need is for you to marry me for 3 months." The woman blinked in disbelief. "You must be kidding. No jokes when it comes to business," Mark said firmly. "It's just a marriage of convenience. No real commitment. After 3 months, we go our separate ways, and you walk away with more money than you've ever dreamed of." After a long pause, she muttered, "Why me?" "Because you're here," Mark replied bluntly. Her reaction almost made her want to leave, but hunger and cold kept her rooted to the spot. "My name is Olivia James," she said softly. "And if I agree, how do I know this isn't some scam?" Mark pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Moments later, a sleek black car pulled up, and a sharply dressed driver stepped out to open the back door. "Get in," Mark ordered. "We'll talk somewhere more comfortable." Olivia hesitated, but the idea of leaving the street behind was too tempting. She climbed into the car, and Mark followed, telling the driver to take them to the nearest hotel. During the ride, the silence was almost unbearable. Olivia watched the city glide by through the window, while Mark busily tapped away on his phone. When they arrived at the hotel, they were shown to a luxurious suite. Olivia couldn't hide her surprise at the plush carpets, elegant wooden furniture, and the amazing view of the city, a setting she'd never imagined for herself. Mark immediately called for room service to bring in food and fresh clothes, while Olivia lingered by the door, watching every move he made. "Relax," Mark said as he poured himself a glass of whiskey. "I'm not here to hurt you. It's just part of the deal." A few minutes later, the food arrived, and Olivia ate without hesitation, feeling her stomach settle for the first time in a long while. Mark observed her carefully, noting her every gesture. "So, do you agree or not?" he asked. Once she finished eating, Olivia wiped her mouth with a napkin and took a deep breath. "How much are you paying me?" $1 million. Mark replied as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Olivia nearly choked at the sheer amount. Money that could let her start over, maybe even help others like herself. But the idea of compromising her dignity made her uneasy. "I need some guarantees," she said, trying to regain control of the conversation. Mark nodded. Everything will be in writing. My lawyer will draft the contract. You'll have food, clothes, and a room at my mansion. And the wedding? Olivia asked hesitantly. Tomorrow, Mark said bluntly. It'll be quick, just a formality. Olivia ran a hand through her hair, feeling trapped. Mark's words left no room for negotiation, and eventually, she sighed and nodded. Okay. Mark smiled, clearly pleased. Excellent. Rest up tonight, because tomorrow marks the start of the rest of our lives. After Mark left, Olivia was left alone in the luxurious suite. The silence was overwhelming. She knew she was taking a huge risk, but it seemed like she had no other choice. The next morning, Olivia was woken by a gentle knock at the door. A hotel housekeeper entered with a tray of breakfast and neatly folded new clothes. Every detail was perfect. The fabrics were soft, the colors neutral, and the clothes fit her perfectly. As she ate, the reality of her decision sank in. She was selling 3 months of her life for $1 million, and suddenly, starting over didn't seem so impossible after all. Soon, Mark reappeared, looking sharp as ever with a leather folder in hand. Here's the contract. Read it, sign it, and meet me at the courthouse at 2 o'clock, he said. Olivia flipped through the document, scanning every clause and term that outlined the agreement. Everything looked legit, though the formality was a bit unsettling. Still, she signed, each stroke of the pen feeling like a step of no return. The wedding was over quickly and without much emotion. Just a few words in front of a no-nonsense judge, a couple of signatures, and it was done. Olivia James was now officially Olivia Rivers, and Mark Rivers was her husband. There were no guests, just the driver and the lawyer witnessing it all. As they left the courthouse, Mark placed his hand on the small of her back, guiding her to the car. It wasn't affectionate. It was almost mechanical, like he was following a routine. Now, let's head to my mansion. That's where you'll be staying for the next few months, he said, not even looking up from his phone. The Rivers mansion was every bit as grand as Olivia had imagined. Tall, automatic wrought iron gates opened to reveal a long driveway lined with meticulously kept gardens. The house itself was enormous, with white columns and huge windows reflecting the sky. Inside, Olivia was greeted by a team of staff members. Mark quickly instructed them to get a room ready for his new wife, while Olivia tried to take in all her new surroundings. By dinner time, Mark invited her to join him. The dining room was huge, with a long table under a sparkling chandelier. Olivia sat at one end and Mark at the other, the distance between them feeling symbolic. Mark, however, simply started eating. "How are you settling in?" he asked casually. "I'm not used to this kind of luxury," Olivia admitted as she looked around. "You'll get used to it," Mark replied with a slight smile. After dinner, he walked her to her room down a quiet hallway. Their voices echoed softly until Olivia finally stopped and asked, "Why are you doing this?" Mark crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. "Because I can." Olivia narrowed her eyes, a mix of anger and curiosity evident. "This isn't something random. People don't just do things like this without a reason." Mark didn't answer, only offering a faint smile before stepping away. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, your transformation begins." Later that night, Olivia sat on the edge of her bed, lost in thoughts as memories of her past resurfaced. It wasn't just the grandeur of the mansion that unsettled her. She realized that she had encountered Mark before. Suddenly, a memory hit her. Years ago, sitting nervously in an interview room, dressed in her best outfit and clutching a carefully prepared resume. The company, Rivers Enterprises, and the interviewer, Mark Rivers. She remembered his cold stare and the harsh remark, "We don't waste time on amateurs." That humiliation had shattered her confidence, sending her life spiraling downwards. And now, here she was, married to the man who had once crushed her spirit. Anger boiled inside her. How could he not remember me? Or did he? And just not care? Determined, Olivia left her room and went to the study where Mark was going over documents. "I need to ask you something," she said, crossing her arms. Mark looked up, surprised by the interruption. "What is it? Do you really not remember me?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Mark frowned, puzzled. Should I? Olivia clenched her fists, fighting back tears. A few years ago, I came to your company looking for a job, and you humiliated me in front of everyone. Mark studied her, as if trying to recall, then finally shrugged. I interview dozens of people every month. I can't remember all of them. Of course you can't, she replied bitterly. To you, we're all disposable. Mark remained silent, but something in Olivia's expression unsettled him. He took a step toward her, yet she was already turning to leave. Alone in her room again, Olivia felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a cold arrangement. It was a chance to face the man who had once destroyed her. But she was no longer that vulnerable young woman. The next morning, with the first rays of sunlight streaming through the enormous windows, Olivia got up, determined not to let the previous night's conversation consume her. She showered and went down for breakfast, where Mark was already seated with a newspaper. Good morning, she said in a neutral tone. Mark simply nodded, his eyes still glued to the paper. The silence between them was heavy, yet Olivia refused to be intimidated. She poured herself a cup of coffee and asked, "So, what's next?" Mark lowered his newspaper and looked at her with a slight smile. Now, your transformation really begins. We've got a team of stylists, etiquette coaches, and even a posture trainer. Soon, you'll be introduced to high society as my wife. Olivia rolled her eyes, as if fancy clothes can erase everything I've been through. Mark ignored her comment. Next week's business dinner is your first test. I need you to be flawless. The days that followed were grueling for Olivia. Every morning brought endless clothing fittings, etiquette lessons, and posture drills. Even though she hated the superficial nature of it all, she slowly started to adapt. Meanwhile, Mark kept his distance, but couldn't ignore the impact Olivia was having on his household. She wasn't like the other women he'd known. She didn't just submit to his authority. One afternoon, while Olivia practiced walking gracefully through the grand hall, Mark entered and watched quietly. When she noticed him, she stopped, crossed her arms, and with a hint of sarcasm said, "Enjoying the show?" Mark smiled slightly. "Just checking your progress. You're doing well." "Great. So my performance meets your approval, Mr. Rivers?" Olivia scoffed. Mark stepped closer, just a few feet away. "Why does it feel like you're always ready to pick a fight?" "Maybe because you deserve it," she shot back without hesitation. Mark paused, surprised by her frankness, then changed the subject. "Get ready. We're going out tonight." "What?" Olivia asked, clearly suspicious. "A private dinner at a restaurant? I want to see how you act in public." That evening, Mark and Olivia arrived at one of the city's most upscale restaurants. Olivia, dressed elegantly, drew admiring glances, though she felt a bit uncomfortable under all the attention. Mark, on the other hand, was completely at ease. During dinner, Mark noticed Olivia's nervousness. She kept glancing around and fiddling with the strap of her dress. "Relax," he said softly. "You're doing great." Olivia looked up, surprised by his supportive tone. "I'm just not used to all this." Mark leaned in a little. "You'll get used to it. Trust me." For a moment, Olivia saw something different in his eyes. He wasn't the cold, calculating guy she had met. He looked almost vulnerable, more human. On the ride back to the mansion, the mood in the car was noticeably lighter. Mark pointed out small improvements in Olivia's behavior during dinner, offering suggestions without his usual harsh tone. "You're really taking this seriously, aren't you?" she asked. Mark glanced at her. "I always take my bets seriously." At the mention of the bet, Olivia tensed. She still wasn't sure what Mark stood to gain from all this, but the thought of being just another pawn in a game left a bitter taste in her mouth. Later that night, alone in her room, Olivia decided to explore the mansion. Wandering through quiet hallways, she discovered a slightly ajar door leading to an office. Inside, a large wooden desk was piled high with papers and documents. Curiosity got the better of her as she began rifling through them. Amidst contracts and financial reports, she found something that made her blood run cold. A printed conversation between Mark and another guy discussing the details of the bet. One message read, "So has she agreed?" And the reply was, "Yes, it's just a matter of time before I win." The words dripped with indifference. Olivia's stomach churned. She had suspected there was more to Mark's actions, but reading it in black and white hurt even more. Suddenly, the door swung open and Mark stepped in. When he saw Olivia clutching the papers, his face hardened. "What are you doing in here?" he asked in a low, tense voice. Olivia glared at him, holding the papers tightly. "Is this how you see me? Just a bet to stroke your ego." Mark stepped closer, trying to take the papers from her, but Olivia pulled back. "Answer me," she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not as simple as you think." "Not simple? You've treated my life like it's disposable," Olivia spat. "Olivia," Mark began, but she cut him off. "Don't try to justify this," she shouted, throwing the papers onto the desk and storming out of the room. Mark stood alone, staring at the scattered pages. For the first time in years, he felt like he'd lost control. Meanwhile, Olivia rushed upstairs, her heart pounding so fast it felt like it would burst. Once inside her room, she locked the door and leaned against it, trying to calm herself. The revelation of the bet had shattered any tolerance she'd built over the past few days. "I can't stay here," she thought, tears of anger and humiliation streaming down her face as she searched desperately for an escape. That very night, while everyone else slept, Olivia put her plan into motion. She changed into simple clothes and packed a small bag with the few belongings she'd managed to gather since arriving at the mansion. Carefully, she opened the window, trying to be as quiet as possible, and climbed down the trellis that supported the climbing roses. The cold night air hit her as she finally reached the ground. She glanced back at the mansion's towering silhouette against the night sky. Part of her wanted to scream, to make Mark feel the same pain she did, but instead, she turned and ran toward the road without looking back. The streets were empty, and Olivia kept going for hours, ignoring the exhaustion and the biting cold. When she finally reached the city center, she found refuge in a subway station where she curled up on a bench and tried to sleep. Back at the mansion, Mark woke early and immediately noticed Olivia was missing at breakfast. At first, he wasn't too worried, thinking she might just need some space after the argument. But when a staff member mentioned they hadn't seen her since dinner, a chill ran down his spine. "Check her room," he ordered calmly. A few minutes later, the butler returned with a concerned look. "Mr. Rivers, her room is empty and the window is open." Mark raced upstairs and entered her room. The bed was untouched, and her clothes still hung in the closet. He went to the window and noticed marks on the trellis. She had escaped. He muttered, clenching his fists, and without wasting another moment, grabbed his phone and started calling contact to track her down. The thought of Olivia wandering alone on the streets filled him with guilt. He couldn't explain it, but something deep inside was urging him to find her. Not because of the bet, but because something new was stirring in his heart. Meanwhile, Olivia wandered aimlessly, struggling to stay upright. Her strength was fading, and she could feel a fever coming on from the exhaustion of the past few days, but she refused to stop. Every step was a declaration of her determination not to let Mark, or anyone, control her again. At dawn, she finally reached a small square and sat on a wooden bench. Her hands shook and her vision blurred. She knew she needed help, but her pride held her back. Eventually, her body gave in to exhaustion as she closed her eyes. Mark, on the other hand, was already scouring the city in his car. He searched every corner and bench for any sign of Olivia. Guilt overwhelmed him. He never imagined his actions could hurt someone so deeply. Hours later, with the sun high in the sky, he finally found her. Olivia was slumped on a bench under a thin blanket, probably given to her by a kind stranger, with a pale face and shivering from a rising fever. "Olivia!" Mark called out, rushing over. She slowly opened her eyes to see his worried face. "What are you doing here?" she whispered weakly. "I'm here to take you home," Mark said, his voice firm yet full of concern. "I don't have a home," she replied bitterly. Mark scooped her up, ignoring her feeble protests, and carried her to the car. On the drive to the hospital, he stayed silent, lost in a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew he needed to do much more than just say sorry if he was ever going to regain her trust. At the hospital, doctors confirmed that Olivia was dehydrated and burning with fever. Mark stayed right by her side as she slept, watching over her while the medical team worked. For the first time in a long while, he felt utterly powerless. Hours later, when Olivia finally woke, she found Mark sitting by her bed, looking exhausted yet deeply focused on her. "Why are you here?" she asked softly. "Because I care," Mark replied sincerely. Olivia let out a small, shaky laugh. "You wouldn't know what caring for someone else means if it wasn't for yourself." Mark lowered his head, his hands gripping his knees. "Maybe you're right, but I'm trying to change." Olivia watched him silently, unsure whether to believe his words. The emotional pain was still too raw. The next morning, Olivia awoke to the sound of footsteps entering her room. Still weak, she turned to see a nurse adjusting her fore. A comforting sight, yet a stark reminder of how vulnerable she was. Mark wasn't there, giving her a moment to relax. Soon, the door opened again, and Mark walked in carrying a small paper bag. Dressed casually, a rarity for him, he looked tired but determined. "I brought you something," he said, placing the bag on the bedside table. Olivia just watched him silently. Mark pulled up a chair and sat a respectful distance away. "It's soup. You need to get your strength back," he explained as he opened the bag. "I don't want anything from you," Olivia replied in a hoarse, cold voice. Mark sighed but didn't push further. He knew forcing anything now wouldn't help. Instead, he let silence fill the room for a while. Finally, Olivia broke the quiet. "Why are you here, Mark?" He hesitated, then answered, "Because I care." Olivia let out a bitter laugh. "You really don't know what that means, do you?" Mark leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Maybe I've spent my whole life not really caring about anyone but myself. But meeting you made me see things I never wanted to face." Olivia looked away, clutching the bedsheet. "That doesn't change what you did, Mark." "I know," he said softly, "and I don't expect you to forgive me anytime soon, but I promise to prove I can be different." For the next few days, Mark stayed by Olivia's side, making sure she got all the care she needed. He coordinated with the doctors, checked that her meals were to her liking, and even brought her books to pass the time. Though still resentful, Olivia couldn't ignore his efforts. One afternoon, while flipping through one of the books Mark had given her, she found a folded, handwritten note tucked between the pages. It read, "Olivia, I know words can't fix what I've done, but I need you to know I'm trying. I'm not usually one to admit mistakes, but you made me face who I really am. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to become someone worthy of your respect." Olivia read the letter repeatedly, trying to figure out if his words were genuine or just another way to manipulate her. Later that night, when Mark came into her room again, Olivia held up the letter. "What is this?" she demanded firmly. Mark glanced at the note. "It's my honest attempt to apologize," he said. Olivia shook her head. "You used me. You humiliated me. How can I trust anything you say?" Mark stepped closer while keeping his distance. "I know I have no right to ask for your trust, but I'm here, and I'll stay, even if it takes years for you to believe me." Tears filled Olivia's eyes before she quickly wiped them away. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she whispered. Mark nodded slowly. "I get it." The next day, doctors told Olivia she was well enough to leave the hospital. Mark wasted no time arranging for her return to the mansion. Although reluctant, Olivia realized she had nowhere else to go. When they arrived back at the mansion, Mark surprised her with a transformed room. A small art studio filled with canvases, brushes, and paints in every color. "What's this?" Olivia asked, stunned. "You once mentioned you liked painting," Mark said with a shy smile. "I thought you might like your own space." Olivia was speechless. It was a simple gesture, but one full of meaning. For the first time, she saw a side of Mark beyond the arrogant billionaire facade. Over the next days, Olivia spent more time in the studio, exploring her creativity. Painting gave her a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, Mark respected her space but continued to ensure she was comfortable. One afternoon, as Olivia painted, Mark appeared in the doorway and said quietly, "You're really talented." Olivia paused and looked at him. "I didn't know you cared about art too." Mark shrugged with a small smile. "I'm learning." She laughed, a genuine laugh that had been missing for so long. As the days at the mansion settled into a new, quieter rhythm, Olivia mostly immersed herself in art while Mark handled his business affairs. There was a fragile peace between them, but Mark knew that words alone wouldn't rebuild the trust he'd shattered. He had to show real change. One afternoon, as Olivia worked on a new painting, Mark waited for her to notice him. Ignoring her work at first, he finally said, "I need your help." Olivia stopped, wiping her hands on a cloth. "My help?" Mark nodded. "I want to start supporting social projects. I think you can help me figure out where to begin." Olivia eyed him skeptically. "Since when do you care about that?" "Since I realized the world doesn't revolve around me," he answered honestly. Olivia hesitated, but the idea of doing something meaningful appealed to her. "Okay," she said at last, "but I'm not doing this for you. I expected nothing less." Mark smiled. In the following days, Mark and Olivia visited various charities and community centers. He took her to shelters, rehab centers, and schools in underprivileged neighborhoods. Olivia noticed that Mark treated people differently. He genuinely listened to their stories and tried to understand their needs. One visit to a women's shelter left a strong impression. While Olivia talked with some of the residents, Mark knelt beside a young woman holding her baby and asked about her life. "It's hard to trust people after all I've been through," the young woman said, clinging tighter to her baby. Mark nodded seriously. Olivia watched from a distance, surprised by his empathy. On the drive back, the car was quiet, but it wasn't awkward. Olivia sensed that something was changing in Mark, even though a wall still stood between them. That evening, Mark arranged a special dinner for just the two of them in the mansion's dining room. Candles, flowers, and soft music set the mood. When Olivia entered, she paused, surprised by the warm atmosphere. "What's all this?" she asked, looking at Mark, who stood by the table. "It's my way of thanking you for everything you've done these past few days," he replied, pulling out a chair for her. Reluctantly, she sat down and watched him closely. Mark looked more vulnerable than ever, yet determined. The dinner started in silence. Then slowly Mark began sharing stories about his childhood, growing up in a cold environment where showing feelings was seen as a weakness. "That's why I always used money as a shield," he admitted while staring at his wine glass. "It was easier than dealing with real people." Olivia listened carefully, torn between empathy and doubt. She finally asked, "So, what do you really want?" Mark met her gaze. "I want to be a better person, someone you might one day respect." Olivia stayed quiet for a long moment before replying, "That's not something you can fix on your own." Mark sighed. "I know, but I'm going to keep trying." After dinner, as Mark cleared the table, Olivia went to her studio and retrieved a small canvas she'd painted recently, a calm landscape with an open field and a sunset sky. "Here," she said, handing it to him. Mark looked at it surprised. "It's beautiful. I thought you might like it." Olivia just shrugged. Mark smiled, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Thank you." In the following days, Mark continued to show small, meaningful changes. He treated the mansion staff with respect, listened to suggestions from his employees, and devoted more time to the social projects he and Olivia had started together. Olivia, although still cautious, began slowly lowering her defenses. One afternoon, while walking through the mansion's garden, Mark suddenly stopped and said, "I want to show you something." He led her to a small cabin at the back of the property. Inside, the room was filled with keepsakes from Mark's childhood, photos, old toys, and even drawings he'd made as a kid. "I've never shown this to anyone," he admitted as Olivia explored the space. She picked up a photo of a young Mark next to an elegant woman she assumed was his mother. "You had a different life than I expected," she remarked softly. Mark gave a sad smile. "My mom used to say that money could buy a lot of things, but not happiness. It took me a long time to learn that." Olivia placed the photo back and looked at him. "Maybe there's still time to learn." As the sun set, painting the sky in warm colors, Olivia walked slowly through the garden, reflecting on the intense days they'd shared. Despite the progress, she still felt guarded. That evening, as Olivia finished a new painting in her studio, Mark appeared at the door holding 2 glasses of wine. "May I come in?" he asked softly. Olivia nodded, and he handed her a glass. They stood in silence, admiring the painting, a portrait of a butterfly perched on a flower, its colors vivid against a soft background. "It's beautiful," Mark said sincerely. "Thanks," Olivia replied with a small smile. Mark took a sip and then said, "You know, the way a butterfly transforms has always fascinated me. It starts off small and limited, but it changes completely over time." "Do you really believe people can change like that?" Olivia asked. "I do, if they truly want to," he answered firmly. Olivia stayed quiet, processing his words. Despite her lingering doubts, she couldn't deny that Mark was different now. The next morning, Mark announced he'd planned a trip. "I want to show you something special," he said mysteriously. Olivia hesitated but eventually agreed. A private plane whisked them away to a small mountain village, a peaceful spot surrounded by breathtaking views. When they arrived, Mark led her to a simple yet cozy house he'd arranged just for the occasion. "Why did you bring me here?" Olivia asked, curious. Mark took a deep breath of the fresh mountain air. "This place reminds me that life can be simple, yet full of meaning. I wanted us to have some time away from everything just to connect." During their stay, Olivia and Mark shared moments that had once seemed impossible. They walked on trails, cooked simple meals, and talked about their hopes and fears. Olivia began to see a side of Mark he'd hidden for so long, a warm, vulnerable side that moved her deeply. As they rested by a quiet lake, Mark broke the silence. "Olivia, I know I still have a lot to prove, but I want you to know that my change is real." She looked at him, surprised by his intensity. "And what do you want from me?" "Just a chance," he said simply. Olivia felt a lump in her throat. For so long, she had built walls around her heart, but now those walls were beginning to crumble. When they returned to the mansion, Olivia felt different, clearer, as if the fog in her mind was lifting. Yet she knew she had to make her decision carefully. That morning, as the sun shone softly through the curtains, Olivia sat up and took in the peaceful silence of the house. Something within her had shifted. At breakfast, Mark greeted her with a warm smile as soon as he put his newspaper aside. "Good morning, Olivia," he said gently. "Good morning, Mark," she replied. The comfortable silence between them spoke volumes. Mark poured her a cup of coffee, watching her take the first sip. He sensed that something had changed, but didn't push the matter. After breakfast, Mark suggested they take a walk in the garden. Olivia agreed, and together they strolled along a path lined with flowers. The gentle sounds of birds and rustling leaves filled the air. When they reached a small stone bench under an old tree, Mark stopped and turned to her. "Olivia, I need to ask you something," he said seriously. She looked at him, waiting. "A while ago, I promised I'd do everything to earn back your trust. I need to know, have I made any progress?" Olivia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his question. Looking into his hopeful, vulnerable eyes, she admitted, "You've changed, Mark, and yes, you're starting to earn my trust." Mark smiled, but then he lowered himself to one knee, pulling out a small velvet box. "Olivia James, will you marry me? Not for a contract, but out of love?" Olivia gasped, her heart racing as tears welled up in her eyes. After a long, silent moment, she smiled and nodded. "Yes, Mark, I will." Mark slipped the ring onto her finger, and they embraced under the tree, a simple, yet profoundly meaningful moment that marked the start of a new chapter. A few weeks later, they held a small, intimate wedding in the mansion's garden. Only a few close friends and partners from their community projects attended, yet the joy and love in the air were undeniable. Olivia looked ethereal in a light lace dress, while Mark, dressed sharply, couldn't take his eyes off her. During the vows, Mark held her hands tightly, his voice filled with emotion. "Olivia, you've taught me the true meaning of love, patience, and redemption. I promise to stand by you through every moment, good or bad, and dedicate my life to your happiness." With tears streaming down her face, Olivia replied, "Mark, you've shown me that people can change, and that love can grow in the most unexpected ways. I promise to love you and walk with you as we build our future together." Their kiss was met with applause and warm smiles, sealing their commitment. For the first time, Olivia felt she was exactly where she belonged. The first year of their marriage brought challenges, but also moments of joy and growth. Together, Olivia and Mark expanded their social projects, helping hundreds rebuild their lives. Their relationship deepened, built on trust and genuine love. One morning, as they prepared breakfast in the kitchen, Olivia turned to Mark with a shy smile. "I have some news," she said, her eyes sparkling. Mark stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "What is it?" "We're going to have a baby," Olivia revealed, her voice trembling with emotion. For a moment, Mark was speechless. Then his face lit up with a radiant smile. He stepped closer and embraced her tightly. "This is amazing, Olivia." The news filled their lives with even more joy, and in the following months, they prepared a nursery and planned for their future as a family. The day Emma Rivers was born became one of the most emotional moments for them. Holding their daughter for the first time, they both felt an instant, deep connection, as if every hardship had led to this very moment. "She's perfect," Olivia whispered tearfully, "just like her mom." Mark replied gently, stroking Emma's head. Emma's arrival brought them even closer, and the mansion, once cold and formal, transformed into a warm, loving home. In the years that followed, their achievements multiplied. The community center they founded became a beacon of hope for thousands. Olivia continued to paint, using her art to raise funds for social projects, while Mark mentored young entrepreneurs eager to make a difference. Emma grew up in a house filled with love and laughter. Mark and Olivia, now true partners in every sense, looked to the future with hope and gratitude. One evening, as they watched Emma sleep, Mark whispered, "You've changed my life in ways I never imagined." Olivia rested her head on his shoulder and replied, "And you've shown me that love can bloom in the most unexpected places." Together, they faced the future, knowing that no matter what challenges came their way, they would always stand by each other, bound by the love that transformed them. What do you think? Did Olivia do the right thing by forgiving Mark? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know how you'd rate this story from 0 to 10. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification bell to keep up with all our stories, and check out more heartfelt tales by clicking here on the end screen.